The morning the will was read, the drawing-room at Wexley Hall smelled of cold ash and beeswax, and Honora Bramwell sat in the plainest chair against the wall, where the family had placed her, with her gloved hands folded in her lap and her eyes lowered to a worn black ribbon she had been turning between two fingers for an hour. The grand seats by the fire had gone to the ones who expected something. She had taken the chair no one else wanted, the one nearest the draught from the corridor, and she had not asked to be moved. Outside, a thin December rain ran down the tall windows in straight gray lines, and the candles guttered each time the door was opened. And the solicitor laid his papers on the table, with a sound like a slow exhale. There were 11 people in that room who had loved old Sir Edmund Carow chiefly for what his death might give them. There was one who had loved him for himself, and the room had decided she did not count. The widow's niece, Lady Pernell Vance, leaned toward her daughter, and said it without lowering her voice at all. "Plain little companion," she said. "Watch how the plain little companion sits there hoping." A few heads turned, and a few mouths curved, and Honora kept her gaze on the ribbon and did not let her face change, though the words went into her like cold water down the back of the neck. She had been Sir Edmund's companion and reader for 3 years. She had learned not to flinch in rooms like this one. What none of them knew yet, what even she did not fully know, was that the old man had spent his last clear afternoon at a writing desk with a solicitor and a steady hand, and that the chair against the wall had been chosen for her on purpose. Stay a moment with her there, against the wall, before the room decides everything. I think you will want to see how this ends. She had come to Wexley Hall on a wet afternoon 3 years before, a clergyman's orphaned daughter, with one trunk and a letter of character, hired to read to a difficult old man whose eyes had begun to fail him and whose temper had driven off 4 readers before her. The family had warned her in the corridor on the first day that Sir Edmund was impossible, that he threw books, that he would not keep her a fortnight. She had gone in, sat down, opened the volume he flung at her feet, and begun to read in a low, even voice as though nothing had been thrown at all. He had listened. At the end of the chapter he had said, in a voice like gravel under a wheel, that she did not simper and that he supposed she might stay until she did. She had stayed. What the family saw across those 3 years was a poor young woman attaching herself to a rich old one, and they named it plainly among themselves the way people name a thing, to make it smaller. Lady Pernell called her the companion with the long view. The widow's son, a florid young man named Crispin Ferrers, who wore his waistcoats too bright and his debts too lightly, called her the little fortune hunter, when he thought she could not hear, and sometimes when he was certain she could. They had measured her by the only ruler they owned, which was wanting, and so they were sure they understood her. They did not understand her at all. She had asked Sir Edmund for nothing in 3 years, but the loan of his books and the use of his garden, and he had remarked once, dryly, that she was the only person in England who had never once asked him for money, and that he found it nearly unbearable. Her wound was older than Wexley Hall, and quieter than anyone there could have guessed. Her father had been the rector of a small parish on the edge of the fens, a gentle, improvident man who could not turn a hungry family from his door, and he had died one February owing money he had borrowed to buy bread and coal for cottages the parish purse could not reach. The men who came afterward came in a gray morning with a list and a cart, and they were not unkind, which somehow made it worse. They were only thorough. They took the rectory furniture piece by piece, while she stood in the cold hall in her father's old coat, the long table where he had written his sermons, the clock that had marked her whole childhood, the books he had loved better than he had ever loved, comfort. They took the small silver her mother had brought to her marriage. And last of all, almost as an afterthought, one of them found the miniature of her mother, in its case in the writing desk, and carried it out to the cart, and Honora had followed him down the path and into the lane, and stood there in the mud, while the case was handed up and sold for a few shillings to a passing dealer, and she could not stop it, because she had nothing to offer in its place, and no name that would make a stranger pause. She had stood in the lane and watched her mother's face go away on the back of a cart, and she had not cried because crying had been shown that morning to change nothing at all. She had learned that day what the world did to a woman with nothing to bargain with. She had learned to want nothing aloud, because wanting aloud was how they found the soft place to press. She kept the black ribbon because it had tied that miniature's case, slipped from the case in the lane and fallen to the ground where the men did not trouble to retrieve it, and it was the only thing of her mother's the creditors had left her, and she had worn it, at her wrist or her collar every day since. Not as ornament, but as the one thing she had never been made to surrender. Into the months of her service there had come, that autumn, a visitor the household had not expected, and could not quite place. Sir Edmund's nearest neighbor and oldest friend had been the late Duke of Aldermere, and when the old Duke died, the title and the lands passed to his son, Gil, and it was the new Duke, Gilbert Marbury, the Duke of Aldermere, who began to ride over from his own estate on grey afternoons to sit an hour with the dying man who had known him since he was a boy in leading strings. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair worn unfashionably plain, and a face that held very still, a jaw set like carved stone, eyes the cool grey of slate after rain. The county called him cold. The county was not entirely wrong, and was entirely failing to understand why. The first time the Duke truly saw her was not a grand moment, and she did not know she was being seen. She had been in the cold east passage with a maid named Susan, whose hands had cracked and bled from the winter scrubbing, and Honora had been winding a strip of clean linen around the worst of the splits, with the same low, even voice she used for the books, telling the frightened girl that she was not to cry over a thing that would be right again. By Twelfth Night, the Duke had stopped in the doorway behind her, unseen, his hand still on the latch. He watched a poor companion kneel on a stone floor to bind a housemaid's hands, and he did not announce himself, and when she rose he had already gone. That evening, at dinner he was quieter than usual, and when Lady Purnell asked his opinion of the new soprano at the Argyle Rooms, he answered her a half-beat, late, as a man does when his mind has been somewhere else entirely. "Come inside," he said to her the first time he spoke to her directly, and she had not understood it as kindness. It was a raw afternoon in late October, and she had carried a footstool out to the south terrace so the old man might sit in the last of the thin light, for he had asked to see the sky once more before the weather closed in, and she had stayed beside his chair without a shawl, because she had folded her own shawl over the old man's knees against the chill. The wind came off the park in long, cold pushes that flattened the dead grass and got under her thin sleeves, and she stood with her arms bare and her chin steady, and did not so much as rub her hands, because to do so would have been to admit she was cold, and admitting need was a habit she had unlearned years before in a muddy lane. The Duke had come around the corner of the house on foot, having left his horse at the stables, and he had stopped at the sight of her, and his eyes had gone over her bare arms, and the goose-flesh on them, and the shawl on the old man's knees, and something had passed across his still face too quickly to name. He said only those two words, low and level, and order, and nothing softer come inside. She had thought him imperious, a great man, irritated by the spectacle of a servant being foolish in the cold. She had taken the chill of it as one more cold thing in a cold house, and had gathered the old man up and brought him in as she was bid. She did not yet hear what the audience by then had begun to hear, which was a man who did not know how to say "be warm," and could not have borne to say it, and so said, "Come inside" instead, and then walked the long way round to the stables again, so that no one should see he had been moved by the sight of a cold-armed girl who would not complain. The household machinery meanwhile had begun to turn faster as Sir Edmund failed. An entail bound the land and the house to the male line, and there was no male line left, but a distant cousin in Shropshire, who never came. Everything not bound by the entail, the money, the plate, the unentailed farms, the contents of the house, fell to the old man's free choosing, and the family had spent the autumn arranging themselves around that freedom like figures around a hearth. Lady Purnell was the widow of Sir Edmund's late brother, and believed the lion's share was owed to blood. Crispin believed it was owed to him because he was young, and male, and in need. A polished cousin from the rival branch, Miss Sabine Lowndes had been brought down from town in ice-blue silk and a great deal of jewelry, and arranged at the Duke's elbow at every dinner, because Lady Purnell had decided 2 birds might be brought down with one season, and that a duke wanting a wife and a fortune wanting an heir might be made to serve each other. Through all of it, Honora read aloud in the sick-room, and changed the water in the old man's glass, and asked for nothing, and was called the companion with the long view in 3 different rooms. I will not pretend the next part was easy to watch, though she did not yet see it coming, and perhaps that is its own small mercy. The witnessing scene that mattered most happened in the library 2 weeks before the end, and again she believed herself alone. Sir Edmund had been wandering in his mind that afternoon, calling her by the name of a sister 50 years dead, frightened of the dark coming early as the sick will be, his hand plucking at the rug across his knees, and his eyes gone wide and young with a fear that had no shape. Honora had drawn a low stool to the side of his chair and taken his restless hand in both of hers and held it still, and when holding did not steady him, she had reached for the worn Bible on the shelf at her elbow and begun to read to him from the Psalms in the low, even voice she used for everything, not because she was devout, for she had buried most of her certainty in a fen churchyard, but because the cadence steadied him, the old, grand, rolling sentences he had loved, when his eyes still worked and could read them for himself. She read him the valley of the shadow and the still waters, and the cup running over, and his hand quieted under hers by slow degrees, and his breathing lengthened, and the fear went out of his face, and at last he slept, with his fingers still curled around her own. Then she sat on in the dark, rather than risk waking him by rising. The fire burned down to a red glow and her own legs gone numb on the stool, and she did not know that the Duke had been shown up to the library to wait while a servant went to see whether Sir Edmund was well enough to receive him. He had stopped at the half-open door. He had stood there in the shadow of the floor-to-ceiling shelves for the length of a psalm, and the length of the long silence after, watching a woman who could have been resting, or scheming, or counting the plate, in an empty house with a sleeping master, choose instead to sit motionless and aching on a cold stool in the dark, so that a dying man might not wake and find himself alone. Nothing in it was performed. She did not know she had a witness. He left without a word, going so quietly down the stair that the servant returning found the room empty, and supposed the Duke had changed his mind. He had not changed his mind about anything. He had only had it changed for him. That night, though, he wrote a letter to his solicitor in London, and the writing of it was the first action in a chain he had not yet admitted to himself he had begun. His coldness had a cause, and the cause had a name, and the night the old man finally died was the night the Duke came nearest to saying it. Sir Edmund had gone quietly in the end. An hour past midnight, with Honora reading to him though he could no longer hear, and when the physician had drawn the sheet and the household had begun its slow grieving business, she had gone out to the long gallery to be away from the family's noise for a moment, and there she had found the Duke. He was standing at the black window at the end of the gallery with an unlit candle in his hand, his back to the row of dead Carows in their frames, and he had come, she understood, not for the family, but for the old man, and had stayed because there was nowhere in particular to take a grief like his. Because the dark hour had stripped them both of their stations, she had asked him, plainly, why he had sat so often through these last months with a man so difficult to sit with, when the county said he cared for no one. He was quiet a long time, the candle unlit in his hand. Then he told her in the low-level voice that gave nothing away and gave everything away, that 10 years before he had let his younger brother Theo go to sea against their father's wish and against his own better judgment, talked round by the boy's eagerness and his own dislike of quarreling and his secret pride in a brother bold enough to want the world, and that the ship had gone down off Finisterre in a winter gale with every soul aboard, and that Sir Edmund Carow was the only man living who had never once told him it was not his fault. The others had all said it kindly and often, and every kind saying had been its own small cruelty, because it asked him to set the grief down before he was ready. Sir Edmund alone had understood that a man does not want the wound denied, only kept company, and had simply sat with him in it, year after year, asking nothing. He carried his brother's last letter in his breast pocket. Still, he said, unopened, these 10 years, the seal never broken, because once it was read the boy would be finished speaking forever, and he had not yet been able to let him finish. He touched his coat over his heart as he said it, once, lightly, and did not seem to know he had done it. He had never said any of it aloud to a living soul. He said it once, to her in the dark gallery with the dead man's house going quiet around them, and then he asked her almost roughly why on earth he had said it, and she answered that she did not know, but that she would not repeat it to anyone for as long as she lived. And he looked at her and believed her, which surprised them both. The reading of the will, then, was not the beginning of the story, but its hinge, and the room that gathered for it was the same room that had spent 3 years deciding what Honora was. The solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Bye. Pelham, with spectacles and a dry cough, settled his papers and began with the small bequests, the rings and the pensions and the named sums to old servants and the family, sat forward by inches as he worked toward the residue. Crispin had a list. Lady Purnell had a face arranged for graciousness. Miss Lowndes had positioned herself where the light from the window fell kindly on her diamonds. And in the chair against the wall, by the cold draught from the corridor, Honora sat with the black ribbon between her fingers and waited for nothing, because nothing was what she had trained herself to expect, and because hoping, in her experience, was only a longer way of being refused. The Duke had come to the reading. No one had quite known why a duke should attend the will of a country baronet, and Lady Purnell had taken it as a great compliment to the family, and seated him beside Miss Lowndes. Accordingly, and he had moved his chair very slightly, and without explanation, a few inches away from the lady in ice blue and toward the cold end of the room, and no one had remarked it, but Honora, who remarked everything and trusted none of it. He sat with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the solicitor. And only once, when Mr. Pelham paused to clean his spectacles, did the Duke's gaze cross the room to the chair against the wall, and rest there a moment, and return. Mr. Pelham reached the residue. He cleared his throat. He read that the entailed estate of Wexley passed, as it must, to the cousin in Shropshire. And then he read that the whole of Sir Edmund Caro's unentailed property, the funds in the 3% amounting to some £40,000, the 4 unentailed farms at Nethercote, the London house in Half Moon Street, the plate, the library, the paintings, and the contents of Wexley Hall down to the last candlestick, was left to Tyre, and without condition, to Honora Ann Bramwell, in gratitude, the will said, for 3 years of company freely given and never once solicited, in the certainty that she alone of all his acquaintance would value the books more than the silver, and in the hope that she would at last have a house no one could turn her out of. The room did not breathe. Honora did not move. The ribbon went still between her fingers. She heard the words and could not make them mean anything, the way a sentence in a language one has half learned will arrive as sound before it arrives as sense. And she sat very straight against the wall and waited for someone to say a mistake had been made. Lady Purnell made the first sound, a short laugh with no amusement in it, and then she said into the ringing quiet that it was monstrous, that the old man had plainly been worked upon, that the little fortune hunter had earned her name at last, and the will would be broken within the month. The word fortune hunter went round the room a second time that day, and was not contradicted. Crispin was on his feet saying something about lunacy and undue influence and his own solicitors. Miss Lowndes had gone white and still in her ice blue silk. The diamonds suddenly only cold stones. And Honora, the named heir to £40,000, and 4 farms and a house in town, sat in the worst chair in the room, and felt the old familiar thing rising. The lane outside the rectory, the cart, the miniature gone, the certainty that a thing given to her was a thing already half taken back. She rose. She did not raise her voice, she said. To Mr. Hafford, Pelham, and to the room that she had not asked for any of it, that she had not known, that she did not require it, and that if it would give the family peace, she would refuse the whole of it, and go, she meant it. That was the thing none of them could parse. the thing that made Lady Purnell's mouth open and close. She was standing in the middle of more money than she had ever imagined, and she was trying to give it away to be let alone, because she had learned that what you held was what they took, and the only safety she had ever found was in holding nothing at all. It was then that the Duke stood up. He did not cross the room in a temper. He set his hat on the chair and walked the length of the drawing-room, past Lady Purnell and past the white-faced rival and past the spluttering Crispin, and he stopped before the chair, against the wall, before the woman trying to refuse a fortune, and the whole room turned, because a duke crossing a room is a thing a room will always turn for. He looked down at her, and his face that the county called cold was not cold at all, and he said the thing he had ridden over to say, the thing the letter to London had been preparing for 2 weeks, the thing he had not let himself know he meant until he watched her try to give away the one safety she had been handed. "Marry me," he said, "and keep all of it." 4 words. They landed in the silence the room had made for them, and could not be taken back. Lady Purnell's fan stopped halfway to her face. Miss Lound made a small sound, and looked at the carpet. Crispin sat down without meaning to, and Honora, who had refused a fortune a moment before, stood with her hand against the cold wall and discovered that her body had understood the words before her mind would let her, because her heart was going hard against her stays, and there was warmth climbing her throat, and she could not, for the length of 3 breaths, say anything at all. She said, when she could, that he could not mean it, that he was a duke, and she was a clergyman's orphan with a black ribbon and nothing else, that he would be ruined in the eyes of every drawing-room in England. He answered, level and low, that he had spent 10 years being approved of by drawing-rooms, and had not once been glad of it, and that he had watched her bind a maid's hands and sit a dark watch by a dying man and refuse a fortune to be let alone, and that he had concluded, slowly, against all his training, that the rooms had been wrong about a great many things, and most of all about her. He had stopped asking what the county would approve. He found he did not care. He had ridden over, he said, not to rescue her, for she had needed no rescuing, and had been about to walk out of that house with her head high and nothing in her hands. He had ridden over because he did not wish to live in a county she had walked out of. Mr. Poles. Pelham, who had drawn up both documents and understood the shape of the afternoon better than anyone, said quietly that the will was sound, witnessed and sealed in the presence of 2 physicians who would attest the testator's clear mind, and that any suit to break it would fail and cost the family dearly in the failing. The procedural door swung shut on Lady Purnell's threat as gently as a man closing a Bible. There would be no breaking of it. The thing was done, and lawful, and witnessed, and the witnesses were already in the room. Lady Purnell tried once more, because a lifetime of being the one who decided does not surrender in a single afternoon. She said, with the diamonds of her own at her throat trembling a little, that the Duke could not seriously intend to lower himself, that the girl was nobody, that she had no people, no portion of her own making, no name. And the Duke turned and looked at her, and did not raise his voice, and said that the Lady Honora Bramwell had 3 years' character from the hardest man in the county, and a fortune of her own as of 11 o'clock that morning, and that he would thank Lady Purnell to wish his betrothed joy. The word betrothed went round the room a 3rd time, and silenced it. Lady Purnell wished her joy. The words came out stiff as a hinge, but they came out, and the room heard the order of things rearrange itself, and the season's verdict on the plain little companion was overturned in the very chair where the season had first delivered it. Honora had not yet said yes. She did the thing that was hers to do, the costly thing, before she let herself have any of it. She told the Duke, in front of all of them, that she would not have him refuse the world's opinion in a warm room and regret it in a cold one, that he must take a week and ride home and be certain, because she had been the thing people regretted before and would not be it again. It was not coquetry. It was the most honest sentence she had spoken in 3 years, and he heard it for what it was. He said he would take the week since she required it, and that he would ride back on the 7th day, and that she might spend the week deciding likewise, because he did not want a wife who had been startled into him in a drawing-room any more than she wanted a husband who had been shamed into her. Then he picked up his hat, and bowed to her only to her, and left the family standing among the wreck of their arithmetic. He rode back on the 7th day. The week between had been the longest of her life, and she had spent it as a woman spends a week she does not believe she will be allowed to keep. The family had withdrawn into wounded conclave, Lady Purnell writing letters to solicitors who wrote cooler letters back, Crispin sulking in the billiard room, Miss Lowndes packed off to town in the carriage with her diamonds and her injured silence. Honora had moved through the great house that was now hers, and did not feel hers. Touching the backs of chairs she half expected to vanish, and at night she had lain awake rehearsing. The moment the Duke would come to his senses, composing in the dark the gracious sentence with which she would release him before he could be embarrassed by his own offer. She had been released before. She knew the shape of the conversation from the other side of it. On the 3rd day, a letter had come from Aldermere, in a strong, plain hand, and she had held it a long while before opening it, certain it was the withdrawal arriving early, and it had said only that the frost was hard and the roads were good, and that he counted 4 days remaining, and was hers, Aldermere, and nothing else. And she had read those few lines a dozen times, and still could not make herself believe them. The rain had stopped by the 6th day, and the country lay under a hard, bright frost that turned every twig to glass. On the 7th, she did not wait in the drawing-room where the family might gather to watch. She went out instead to the garden Sir Edmund had let her use across 3 winters, the walled kitchen garden gone to sleep for the year. Among the bare rose stems she had pruned with her own cold hands and the espaliered pears nailed flat against the south wall. She had spent the week walking these paths and arguing herself out of believing, and failing to stay convinced. When the garden gate opened and he came through it, his greatcoat dark against the white morning, and his breath smoking in the cold, she saw at once that he had not changed his mind, and he saw at once that she had not refused him in her heart, however carefully she had guarded it, and for a moment neither of them said the practical thing. He reached out and took the black ribbon where it hung at her wrist, the ribbon from her mother's miniature, and he turned it once in his fingers, as a man turns a thing he means to keep safe, and he asked her whose it had been. She told him. She told him about the lane and the cart and the miniature sold off the back of it, the wound she had never spoken to a living soul, and he listened the way he had wanted to be listened to in the gallery, without denying it, and without trying to mend it, only keeping her company in it. Then he said her name, her given name, Honora. The first time it had ever been in his mouth, and the sound of it undid something she had kept tied for 10 years. She said yes in the garden, with the frost on the rose stems and her breath white in the cold air, and his hand still holding the ribbon at her wrist, and he did not seize her or speak grandly. He only bent his head until his brow rested against hers and stood so, the two of them breathing the same cold air, 2 people who had each learned to want nothing aloud, and were learning late and carefully to want this. He had brought something with him, he said at last, and from his breast pocket he drew, not his brother's letter but a small flat case, and inside it was the miniature of her mother, the very one recovered by a London agent across 3 weeks of patient inquiry after a Duke's letter set him searching. Bought back at last from a dealer in the Strand who had no notion what he sold. He had not known if he would have the right to give it to her. He gave it to her now. She held her mother's face in her 2 hands in the frozen garden and wept at last. The first time she had let herself. And he stood beside her and let her, and asked for nothing, which was the only language she had ever fully trusted. They were married quietly, in the spring, in the small grey church near Aldermere, with the hawthorn just coming into bud along the lane, and a handful of people in the near pews who had earned the right to be there. The Duke's old housekeeper, who had known him since he was a boy, and had never once expected to see this day, stood at the front in her best bombazine, and wept into a handkerchief through the whole of the service. Sir Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Pelham, stood witness, his spectacles fogging, glad in his dry, careful way to see a document of his become a marriage. And the housemaid Susan, whose cracked hands had long since healed clean, stood at the back in a new bonnet the Duchess had given her, and curtsied so deeply when Honora passed that she nearly overbalanced. There was no crowd, No ballroom, no orchestra, nothing the season would have recognized as a triumph, and that was precisely as the bride had wished it. Lady Purnell sent her formal compliments, and did not come, which everyone agreed was for the best, and Crispin's debts were quietly settled by the new Duchess, for no reason but that she could, and that cruelty had never been her instrument. And he was so confounded by the kindness that he wrote her, mended his ways, at least as far as his nature allowed. Miss Lowndes married a baronet in Kent within the year, and was by every account content enough to have been spared a husband who had never once looked at her across all those carefully arranged dinners. The £40,000 and the 4 farms and the house in Half Moon Street became in the end what the old man had meant them to be, which was simply a floor beneath a woman's feet that no one could ever again pull away. On the first hard evening of the following winter, the new Duchess of Aldermere sat in the library at Aldermere, with the fire built high, the snow coming down past the tall windows in the slow way of deep country, and her husband sat across from her with his boots to the fender, and a book open and unread on his knee, watching her the way he had watched her in a doorway long before she knew it. Well, on the table between them, in a small frame she had chosen herself, stood the miniature of her mother, and beside it, propped against the lamp, hung the black ribbon, no longer doing any work, kept only for what it had survived. She had asked the world for nothing across all the cold years of asking nothing. And the asking nothing had not been a strategy, and had never been rewarded, until the one season it was, by an old man who saw it, and a cold man who learned to. The fire settled. The snow went on falling past the glass on a house that was hers, in a room no one could turn her out of, and for a long while neither of them felt any need to speak. If Honora's story stayed with you, I hope you will sit a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and tell me if you like which moment you will carry. Thank you for staying with her until the end.